A new book raises questions about whether the federal government is doing enough to ensure the safety of generic drugs coming into the United States. 9 out of every 10 prescriptions filled are generics. That saves Americans some $3 billion a week over the cost of brand name drugs. And many of those generics come from abroad, with 80% of active ingredients and 40% of finished drugs coming from outside the U.S. Anna Werner spoke to several people who are concerned about efforts to inspect those overseas facilities. And it's a story you'll see only on CBS This Morning. Anna, good morning.
Good morning, Nora. We've all heard that generic drugs are basically the same as brand name drugs. After all, they have the same active ingredients, and their manufacturers are supposed to prove that they work the same way as their brand name counterparts. But are all of those drugs manufactured overseas really the same?
I'm thankful that I'm still here.
When we met Cedric Brown, he was in the hospital for a foot infection. But that was a big improvement from 7 years ago, when his heart failed and he underwent a transplant. Did you feel really different after you got the transplant?
Definitely, I felt great.
The operation was a success, but months later, Brown's condition deteriorated, and he came back to the Cleveland Clinic, where Dr. Randall Starling found Brown's body was rejecting his new heart.
We had to figure out why. Why did this happen to Cedric?
Dr. Starling discovered that the brand name anti-rejection drug Brown had been taking, called Prograf, had been switched for a generic manufactured in India. You look at this bottle, and I take it questions were immediately raised in your mind.
Immediately.
Questions because that particular drug was on a list of generic medications his hospital tries to avoid prescribing to its patients. The FDA says a generic medicine is the same as a brand name medicine in dosage, safety, and quality. But experts at the Cleveland Clinic have determined some generics aren't a close enough match for their comfort, that even a small variance in the drug may pose serious risks for some patients. So you can't take the risk that a drug is just slightly less than what the patient needs, or maybe more.
In a given patient that's high risk for rejection, there may be no leeway whatsoever.
I remember him saying it was the medication that caused what happened to me.
And so then, did things get better after that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Still here.
It's a window into a larger problem, says investigative journalist Catherine Eban.
This is all I have done for the last 5 years.
She wrote a book called Bottle of Lies. She says the problem is that the U.S. relies on information submitted by drug makers in order to approve their generic medications. But some overseas manufacturers aren't being honest.
There are many companies in the industry that are falsifying their data.
Falsifying data, straight out
fraud.
The first major fraud case came to light 14 years ago, that of Indian generic manufacturer Ranbaxy. The company paid a $500 million penalty as part of a 2013 settlement for selling adulterated drugs and making fraudulent statements to the FDA. Former Ranbaxy executive Dinesh Thakur was the whistleblower on the case. Are they the poster child for how bad things can get?
I wish I could say that. I've seen similar behavior in other companies since 2013.
So they're not the only ones?
No.
Eban says a major part of the problem is the FDA's efforts to regulate overseas drug production.
Our entire drug supply has changed. Now these drugs are overseas and the FDA is forced to be a global agency. So the question is it up to the task or not?
And how well is that going for them, did you find?
Very badly.
She explains that while FDA inspectors in the U.S. often show up at plants unannounced, overseas companies are frequently warned weeks in advance that inspectors are coming.
These inspections that are taking place overseas are essentially staged inspections.
Staged? What do you mean by staged?
They're staged by the companies.
The FDA told us in a statement that it inspects all brand name and generic manufacturing facilities around the world and says it's conducted a number of unannounced inspections at foreign plants when the agency has information from a whistleblower or when the FDA is investigating a drug safety issue. But this former FDA investigator told us when he and others dug deeper into the records at those companies, they found serious problems. Did you see problems that you considered to be fraud?
Yes.
We're not showing his face or using his real voice, but reports he and other inspectors filed show they found numerous generic drug makers falsifying records, covering up manufacturing problems, and attempting to hide poor test results.
If the data is not accurate, or if the data is falsified,
Right.
do we know what the drug is that's coming out on the end for sure?
We would question the safety and efficacy of those drugs, yeah.
The FDA says it's modernized its policies in recent years and that Americans can be confident in the quality of the products the FDA approves. But those inspection reports came as unwelcome news to Dr. Starling.
My initial reaction is anger. To falsify information, to manufacture and make a profit on a drug is just unconscionable to believe that that could happen.
Well, the group that represents generic drug makers disagrees. It says the industry is contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to help the FDA increase the frequency of inspections. And it notes if there are issues going undetected by the FDA, there would be severe health issues in this country.
So, Anna, I watched this story and I just think it's so scary. So how do you know where your generic drugs are made, where they're coming from?
You know, it's a really difficult thing. One of the problems here is the lack of public information. You can ask your pharmacist which company made your generic medication, but you're going to have to do some research to figure out whether that company has ever had to recall products or has been found to have had manufacturing issues. And it's really difficult, if not impossible, to find out where the companies actually make the drugs, as in which country. The FDA told us that that's considered confidential information under federal law.
Yeah, it's very disturbing because I could ask the question, they could tell me the Werner company, I wouldn't know what that meant. So for those of us who buy generic drugs a lot, it's very disconcerting.
Yeah, and for certain patients who need these sort of these drugs that apply in a very narrow range, that's where some of these risks come in, according to the doctors at the Cleveland Clinic, because the dosage has to be so specific and so exact that if it's not, it runs the risk of affecting their transplant.
And almost cost somebody his life.
Thank you, Anna.
Careful. Thank you, Hannah.